On the 4th of July, 1915, a letter ran in the pages of the Oregonian and the Oregon Daily Journal. It told of the dangers of a vicious film, one that was due to arrive in the city of Portland. A film that, as the author of the letter warned, would threaten to incite racial tensions across the state, if it was allowed to be shown. That letter marked the beginning of a decades-long campaign by the editor of Oregon's only black newspaper against the blockbuster film The Birth of a Nation. At the turn of the 20th century, the film industry was still in its infancy. Motion pictures were rarely more than an hour long and were completely silent. Even so, those in the fledgling industry knew about the ability of cinema to inspire or to inflame. Filmmakers increasingly experimented with the medium's possibilities in communicating human emotions and ideas. One such filmmaker was D.W. Griffith, the son of a colonel in the Confederate Army. Griffith was born in Kentucky a decade after the Civil War. From a young age, he became enamored with the racial thought of the South. After an unsuccessful career as an actor, Griffith turned to directing films, inventing cinematic techniques that had never been used before. On July 4th, 1914, Griffith began filming what would go on to become his magnum opus. Meanwhile, journalism in the United States was nearing its heyday. Black newspapers sprang up around the nation, covering issues of race, discrimination, and culture that were seldom discussed by the white press.
Every generation of Black life in this country has had a responsibility and opportunity to make a contribution to righting the wrongs that have been imposed and inflicted on the Black population from the early days of the country. And journalism was one of the weapons, one of the tools, one of the ways in which that struggle was carried on.
In Oregon, a 4-page weekly publication titled The Advocate was founded by Edward Kennedy, but it would take a woman from rural Texas to bring the paper to national prominence. Beatrice Morrow Cannady was born in Littick, Texas in 1889. She moved to her adopted state of Oregon after university at the age of 22. Soon after arriving in Portland, Beatrice married Edward Kennedy and became the assistant editor of The Advocate. She immediately began to editorialize against the state's Jim Crow laws, working to integrate schools, theaters, and restaurants, and fighting for civil rights. However, white Portlanders awoke in the summer of 1915 not to headlines in The Advocate, but to full-page advertisements in many of the state's largest newspapers. A motion picture, set to arrive in Portland, which had already taken the nation by storm. Over 3 hours long and featuring a cast of 18,000, The Birth of a Nation quickly became the most successful box office attraction of its time. Audiences nationwide praised the innovative techniques and gripping storylines shown in the film, which had cost over $500,000 to produce. In creating the film, D.W. Griffith received inspiration from a novel by writer Thomas Dixon titled The Klansman. Although under a different name, the film followed Dixon's version of the events of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and most alarmingly, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. It glorified the cause of the Confederacy, presented historical fabrications as fact, and offered a racial viewpoint that Black Americans were not only inferior, but insidious. Griffith and Dixon were convinced that these ideas would be more widely communicated to the public when brought to the silver screen. Their theory proved to be true. Moved by its grandeur, many viewers began to sympathize with the racist motivations of the Klan and accept the hostile myths and stereotypes regarding Black Americans shown in the film. After screening the film at the White House, President Woodrow Wilson described it as history written in lightning. As the film's popularity swept across the country, its brazen racism and divisive messaging meant to instill fear and hatred entered into the public consciousness. And with The Birth of a Nation scheduled to premiere in Portland in August of 1915, Beatrice Morrow Cannady knew that she could not sit idle. The film would worsen the discrimination and racial prejudice that she had worked for years to eliminate. So while other Portland residents celebrated Independence Day, Cannady took to the typewriter, harnessing one form of communication to combat another. But despite her best efforts, The Birth of a Nation made its Portland debut at the Halig Theater on August 29, 1915. Reviewers described it as a spectacle, with the theater's balconies being draped with American flags, and a 12-piece orchestra accompanying the showing of the film. The crowded audience cheered when the Ku Klux Klan appeared on screen, enthralled by the marvel of the production.
So on the one hand, no, they didn't get the film banned, but on the other hand, they were able to raise the issues. It was not simply a passive acceptance of that kind of corruption of the Black experience or of American history. And so in that sense, it was a victory.
The Birth of a Nation would return to Portland numerous times in the following years, and each time, Cannady spoke out against it, keeping the issue on the public's agenda. Because of her activism, Portland residents started to understand the negative impacts of the film. However, much of the damage was already done. On Thanksgiving night in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been defunct for nearly half a century, was revived. Its organizers were inspired by Griffith's film and even adopted it as a recruitment tool, attracting millions of members at its peak. Many of the Klan's tactics, as well as their costumes, were taken directly from the screen. As the now editor of The Advocate, Cannady kept readers aware of the Klan's activities across Oregon until its ultimate demise near the end of the 1920s. Cannady's efforts to confront racism through communication went far beyond her work as a journalist. She helped found the Portland branch of the NAACP, serving as its first secretary and spokesperson. On Sunday afternoons, she often invited hundreds of guests from all backgrounds to her own home to mingle, occasions which she referred to as interracial teas.
She really was able to connect with people and to just be really open and honest with them, and to tell them what it was like to be a Black person in Oregon, or a Black person in America for that matter.
Whether it be at the typewriter, podium, or the living room table, Cannady constantly advocated for better social relations and reform. And eventually, after organized opposition from a number of groups in Portland, The Birth of a Nation was barred from the city's theaters. D.W. Griffith's film was able to influence public opinion for the time being, but due to the work of Cannady and others, it would go on to be regarded as one of the most controversial motion pictures ever made. Through her advocacy, Cannady not only provided a prominent voice for Black Americans in Oregon, but also proved that journalism was an effective tool in opposing new forms of racist propaganda. Her decades-long campaign paved the way for future movements throughout the 20th century. In the early 1930s, Cannady and her newspaper continued to serve Oregon's Black community. But with the onset of the Great Depression, it was forced to cease publication in 1936. Cannady retired from public life and moved to Los Angeles, where she continued to work as a journalist for a local Black newspaper. Although she passed away in 1974, Cannady's legacy lives on. In 2018, the Beatrice Morrow Cannady building was opened in downtown Portland, and in 2019, a new elementary school in the North Clackamas School District was named in her honor. As the birth of new methods of mass communication spreads ideas wider and faster than ever before, the need for social advocacy remains paramount. Only by using our voices to illuminate rather than instigate can we hope to achieve a better understanding of each other and of ourselves.